My first experience with the U.S. Constitution, very first experience with the U.S. Constitution, was on a television show, a detective show from America, and a criminal was being arrested, and he said, "I'm pleading the fifth, man." And I had no idea what that was. In my part of the world, the fifth would be Beethoven's famous symphony. Those famous first notes. Well, anyway, I've never forgotten that, and it's just a wonderful idea. The idea that you can remain silent under investigation. And then, of course, we have the First Amendment. The irony here is that here you're allowed to say whatever you want. And as my student said, you've got the First Amendment that allows you to say whatever it is you want, and the Fifth Amendment that allows you to shut the up. Well, this is unique. 237 years ago, my country is 2,000 years old. England is over 2,000 years old. Keep this in mind. 237 years ago, 55 men entered a public hall in Philadelphia. They were all men. They were all white men, and many of them would identify themselves as gentlemen. They were some of the finest minds collectively that I think in history have ever been brought together at one period in time. They came to Philadelphia from as far away as Massachusetts. They came by horse, by carriage. Remember, this is a time when anything that moved, an animal was either pulling or pushing it. This was before the age of steam. They came from the south, and I think Benjamin Franklin had the least amount of miles to travel. In fact, he lived just around the corner from Independence Hall on Market Street, and kind of a funny story here because he was actually brought into the hall. He had severe gout. He was already in his 80s, by the way. Otherwise, I think, you know, he would have been a good contender for one of the early presidents, but he was already in his 80s in 1787. He was brought into the hall on a sedan chair by 4 convicts from the local jail because he had gout, and they just carried him in. There are 2 handles here, 2 handles there, and they carried him in, plunked him down on his seat, and he remained there throughout the convention, you know, breaking wind and chipping in his tuppence worth every now and again. George Washington was the presider, or you could say the president, and so every member there, if they wanted to speak, all the delegates had to address Mr. President, even long before he becomes president, of course. And this is what they produced. This is the Constitution of the United States of America. For me, it's a work of art. It's not very long, and it's 200. It was ratified in 1788, so it's 238 years old. Again, England's 2,000 years old. This Constitution has 4,500 words. Hamlet, perhaps the greatest play ever written by Shakespeare, has 30,000 words, and the New Testament has 765,000 words. This has 4,500 words. It was written 238 years ago, when there were, what, 3 million people in America? Or thereabouts. I get different figures from different reports. Today, there are 330 million Americans, and not just 330 million Americans, but 330 of the most cantankerous individuals on God's earth. And yet it still works. The preamble, if we can understand what happened here, in 1787, your country was, the Revolutionary War came to an end in 1781 with the Battle of Yorktown. The Peace Treaty of Paris that settled the peace, and by the way, that gave you all the land, not just independence, but all the land west of the Appalachians to the Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, that came with the package. This was settled in 1783. And it was almost like, you know, yes, you won the war, but my word, there was mayhem between the states. The states were competing for the land west of the Mississippi. They were zealously guarding their independence. There was a government in place. It was called the Articles of Confederation, but it really lacked an executive authority. It had no president. It had no judiciary branch, and even the legislative branch, you know, had to practically go begging to the states for tax money. So it wasn't working. It wasn't working. So it was decided then to to go to Philadelphia and have a constitutional convention to revise or to make good, make better the Articles of Confederation. What they did instead was to chuck it out the window altogether and rewrite, you know, a brand new constitution. And this is it here. You can see in the very preamble quite what was wrong, because in the preamble it says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union," so there, in order to form a more perfect union. So the union wasn't perfect, okay? In fact, actually, the irony of the Revolutionary War is that England unified America. But once England was out of the picture, the common enemy was out of the picture, you know, we were in disarray. So in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, and to ensure domestic tranquility, and to provide for the common defense and the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States of America. So you can see right therein, if you're interested in history, you don't have to read any secondary source. You can see right there in the preamble quite what the problems were. Once there, they were there for 4 months, if you can believe it. There's no air conditioning. They were held to, the Rules Committee was very strict, and the Rules Committee ordered that there be no exchange of information. Newspapers or pamphleteers who were obviously anxious to know what was going on there, very un-American to have this done in total secrecy, I should say. Windows were closed, and when they were open, there was a security detail to make sure that information was not being passed out of the room, and that there would be nobody peeking in. A very interesting story. The Rules Committee was so strict, and the presider, President Washington, you know, people had so much respect for him that after one day's, you know, discussion, somebody left their notes behind in the men's room or somewhere. And so these notes were brought into the president, they were put on the desk, and at the start of the next day, it was announced that somebody had left their notes in the men's room or somewhere. Nobody claimed them. I thought that was interesting. And from what I've read, it's because of the sheer respect they had for George Washington. They didn't want to get on the wrong side of him, you know, so, all right. There were two things going on in the backs of the minds of these 55 geniuses, in my opinion. Equality and power, and we need to look at these things. It all started with Thomas Jefferson, who was not there, by the way. Thomas Jefferson was not at the convention. He was in Paris. He was your very first ambassador to Paris. But he was exchanging letters with James Madison, who was there, and they were good friends. Thomas Jefferson had written something rather unusual in the Declaration of Independence, which quite frankly shocked the world. He had written that basically he was saying to anybody who cared to read it that, look, this revolution is not about economics, it's not about paying taxes or not paying taxes. It's that we have these beliefs, you know, we're no longer Englishmen, we're a little different. And we have these beliefs, among which, you know, we believe that all men are created equal, and that they're entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where did this come from? That's what we need to ask ourselves. Where did this come from? Nothing could be further from the truth. Equality didn't exist anywhere in the world, as far as I know, certainly not in Europe. In fact, if anything, equality didn't exist. And in fact, inequality was the order of the day. In fact, England was characterized by three hierarchies: a military hierarchy, a religious hierarchy, and a social hierarchy. The military hierarchy, whether in the army or the navy, you start with your field marshal on down to colonels and majors and lieutenants and so on. The religious hierarchy, you have we'd already had the Reformation by then, so you would have the archbishops, the bishops, and the priests, and so on. But the main hierarchy was social, and that had to do with how England was organized. At the top of this social hierarchy, you had the monarchy or royalty. So we would have an emperor, a king, and a prince, and so on, and the female equivalents of those. But under that, you had the nobility, and the nobility, the non-vile, they didn't work their hands in dirt, is where it comes from. They were the nobility, and they were the dukes, and the marquises, and the earls, and the barons, the viscounts and the barons. Many of these were in the in government at the time of the American Revolution. These are what we call lords. These are what we call lords. And believe it or not, they still exist. And in fact, many of them still sit in the House of Lords, which is our second chamber. It's our Senate, if you like. But where did this thing called equality come from? I have to believe, I have no way of knowing, but I have to believe that in the pubs and the taverns in England, people were laughing their heads off, saying, equality? Get out on your bike, mate, is what you hear. On your bike, in other words, get out of here. Where did it come from? I mean, did it just come out of the air? I mean, there was nothing equal about Thomas Jefferson even, he had no equal. These people were, well, where did equality come from? And so we have to look at this. But then again, people were laughing their heads off at this idea of equality. And then 143 years later, all right, in 1919, just to make manifest this idea of equality, we had the end of World War I. And at the end of World War I, the four empires in Europe came tumbling down, and it was left to an American president who spent quite a few months, by the way, in Paris during the Paris peace talks to make the world safe for democracy. And this is President Woodrow Wilson. He had no intention of, usually if you go to war, you go to war for a booty. In other words, land or whatever. My students tell me that booty has another meaning. Well, maybe you go to war for that too. But he insisted that, he just wanted to make the world safe for democracy. Took nothing, took absolutely nothing. How noble is that? How noble is that? He just wanted to make the world safe for democracy. It was based on his 14 points that Germany surrendered, or at least, we had the armistice. And that was the big contention because, it wasn't an armistice, it wasn't a surrender, and it certainly wasn't an unconditional surrender. But yet at Versailles, the British and especially the French wanted to stick it to the Germans. And of course, President Wilson had no power over that. And when he returned to America, unfortunately, your very Senate had turned down the League of Nations. So, otherwise maybe things would have been different in Europe during the 30s. There was some speculation that he was a Democrat, a Presbyterian minister's son, and he had these great ideas. One of your great intellectual presidents, by the way, he had a PhD. And he didn't take any Republicans with him, so there was a little of that going on. But anyway, my point though is that, we were laughing our heads off in 1776 when Thomas Jefferson wrote those immortal words that all men are created equal and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 149 years later, in 1919, who is laughing now? Where this upstart nation, 149 years later, is actually attempting, not to say they succeeded, but attempting to settle the peace of Europe. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men, they couldn't put Humpty together again. But President Wilson would try. The four empires that came collapsing, the Russian Empire, the Romanovs of Russia, where they executed the Tsar's family, the Hohenzollerns of Germany came tumbling down, the end of that empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire came tumbling down, the Habsburgs, and of course the one we don't talk so much about, the Ottoman Empire in southeastern Europe, came tumbling down, the Ottomans. But a fifth empire was less severely impaired, and that was my country, that was the British Empire. Yes, Queen Victoria was an empress, we had India. Yes, her son, Edward VII, was an emperor. George V was an emperor. So all this ended with the Great War, and it's America now, and it's kind of curious because it's at this juncture, because America is not quite the world power yet, but as America is coming up now, Britain is slowly going down. So it's one of the interesting dynamics of history. So equality is what you're committed to, and I still like to know where this came from. There are some ideas. America, it has been said, and I believe this, that Americans have no time for philosophy, for ideas for the sake of ideas. Americans like the idea of philosophy if it has some practical application, you know, if you can get your teeth into it, or if you can get your hands on it. But there was one philosopher, or a few actually, but there was one in this time period that really impressed Jefferson, and his name was John Locke. He was English, and he was writing against the idea of divine right of kings in England. And he wrote a theory called the tabula rasa, it was called. And the tabula rasa means a blank slate. He was arguing in the late 1600s that, you know, we're all equal. We're all born with a tabula rasa. We're all born, you know, we're all born the same, is what he's saying. And the only thing that makes me different from you would be life's experiences. And this, Jefferson was a great reader. He read this. In fact, I know we will all know he read it because the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness came right out of John. He wrote Life, Liberty, and Property. But Thomas Jefferson switched property, because remember, slaves were property at this time, switched property to the pursuit of happiness. So that could be one theory where this idea of equality came from. And then, even before the Constitution was written, state constitutions were written. I don't know if you're aware of it, even during the Revolutionary War and up to 1787, the states were writing their own constitution. And one of the things that they outlawed, not here, but in the state constitutions, was primogeniture. Now, primogeniture is the essence of this class structure in Europe. It means firstborn. And it means that, for instance, you know, when Queen Elizabeth II died, Prince Charles, her eldest son, would take everything. And what it meant to the classes below was that, you know, the Duke's son would become the next Duke. The Marquis's son would become the next Marquis. The Earl's son would become the next Earl, and so on. You did away with this, and we need to think about this. We don't talk about it even, but because in America, you made it clear right from the very start your commitment to this idea of equality by abolishing that. Today, it's such that in America, you know, when the parents die, the children is shared among the children. The wealth, you know, it doesn't go to one person; it's shared among the children. you know, unless you piss them off, and then, you know, they might, you know, create a university or something, anyways. Which is also a very idea. And then in the Constitution, and I want to read this because this is actually in the Constitution. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept of any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatsoever from any king, prince, or foreign state. So what you're doing here is, it seems to me at any rate, in this commitment to equality, is you're removing yourself from hierarchical Europe. You're removing yourselves from hierarchical Europe, and you're saying, look, we are different. We are different. We don't need this class structure. And actually, a landed gentry in America wouldn't make sense anyway, because remember, the one thing you had was land, you know, the vastness of land. The one thing you didn't have was labor. We had labor in Europe, and you know, and Europeans wanted the land. So, you know, it worked. And by the way, this is also something to consider when we talk about slavery in a moment. You needed the labor. You had the land, but you didn't have the labor. And so if so many people held land, it would make a mockery of title because everyone would have it. So it didn't make sense. So there is this practical, you know, idea to this commitment to equality. The final thing, and this was written much later in the late 1800s, a great historian called Frederick Jackson Turner argued that he wrote a great book on the closing of the frontier, and he argued that moving west, you know, the people moving western to the western areas exerted a strong influence on American democracy, and I believe that to be true. So the more you moved out west, the more equal you became, and titles and you know, things like this just did not exist. Okay, that's equality. The other thing in the backs of these people's minds was the concept of power. And it's kind of ironic in a way when you think about it, that this country, still so young, was created in a room by a committee, you know. And it was almost like the reason they were there is because the Articles of Confederation at the time, they didn't have it. Like I said, they had no executive, no president, no judiciary, and even the legislative branch had to practically go begging to the states for tax money. So, you know, on the one hand, you know, there was a lack of power, but at the Constitutional Convention, the whole 4 months seemed to revolve around this notion of how not to make it so powerful. In other words, to try to get it just right, you know, because if you have the big fear was that if they created an executive, that executive would become king. And that was the big fear at the time, you know, and this is why eventually they do settle on the separation of powers. George Washington, one of the other noble things about America is that George Washington, well, first of all, after the Revolutionary War, he laid down his sword, his military sword, to the Confederation Congress. And yet, you know, when someone as popular as he was, you know, they would automatically assume the position of emperor. His contemporary, Napoleon. In fact, Napoleon, the French Revolution began the year that George Washington became president, 1789. And it could so easily have been done. He was so popular, there was so much disorder that he could easily become a king or emperor, but no, he lays down his sword. How noble is that? He laid down his military sword. I'll never forget, I cannot get over that, because in Europe, you don't do that, you know. Alexander, you know, the Caesars, you know, Napoleon, you just don't do that. But here, he laid down his military sword. I think we need to remember this. And to add to his nobility, he becomes president, and then after 2 terms, because there was no constitutional amendment restricting, the number of terms you could run for at this time, he laid down his political sword. After 2 years, he still enormously popular. He laid down his political sword. He said, I'm resigning, time for a new president. How noble is that? Absolutely amazing. So I think what I'm talking about is American exceptionalism, because people lately have been trashing this idea, but I really believe that it exists. It exists. This is, and then we have this transfer of power. That every 4 years or 8 years, if the president loses, then the transfer of power is always something that I watch every 4 years. It's one of the most amazing things. It's a peaceful transfer of power, and one would never expect that an outgoing president would deny that he lost the election. It is a peaceful transfer of power when you think about it, and this all has to do with the concept of this convention that we needed a government, right, but we didn't want it to be so powerful. Incidentally, if you look up here, the aspirations for the Americans had really nothing to do with France or England at the time, but with ancient Rome and Greece. The capital here, this dome, anywhere else in Europe, that's a cathedral, and some people called this, I think Ken Burns called it the Temple of Democracy. So in Rome, that would be St. Peter's or St. Paul's. In England, it would be religious, Here it's a Temple of Democracy. And on the top is Lady Liberty. You can't see there, but she's sitting right at the top. Lady Liberty. So that's Rome, very Roman. But if you come down, look at the Supreme Court on the right, with the pillars there, that's right out of ancient Athens. In fact, that's the Acropolis. If you look at the Acropolis, it still stands, but it's in ruins. That's where that comes from. So this architecture here even harkens back not to Rome, or not to France or England, but rather to these ancient civilizations. And I think that's how America saw herself, perhaps as a new Rome, a new Greece, rather than a new England or a new France. And when I first went to Washington, I've had the pleasure, by the way, of being in each building some years ago, more difficult now. And when I was there, I'll never forget my first impression. It was like Rome, but much more spacious. It's almost like the new Roman world, but much more spacious. A couple of things. We want to talk now a little bit about the amendments here. The First Amendment says that, and this is again extraordinary, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I'll read it again. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And what is meant by that is that at the time, most of the European countries had an established religion. And in fact, we still do in England. In England, the established religion is Anglican. The Church of England is the established church. In America, because of this amendment, all churches are equal. But in England, the Church of England is still the established church. That's what we mean by establishment, the establishment clause, and it still exists today. In fact, if you can believe this, the two archbishops, Archbishop of Canterbury and Archbishop of York, and 26 senior bishops, actually sit in the House of Lords still today, which is a legislative body. So we don't have a separation of powers still today. But it's this idea of a separation of church and state, as Thomas Jefferson called it, by the way. Those words are not in the Constitution. It was Thomas Jefferson who, upon reading the Constitution, as I said, he was in Paris at the time, but upon reading it, he said, oh my God, we've got a separation of church and state. And so it is. But those words are not actually in the Constitution. I say this because a lot has been made of the First Amendment. For instance, public schools cannot have prayer and this sort of thing. But that's not, I don't believe that was the original intention. I think the original intention was to get away from Europe, and move away from this established church in England, which, as I say, is still there. And I don't know if you've thought about it, but if you think about it, because of this amendment, it's very brief, because of this First Amendment, America has never, nor will ever, fight a religious war. Now, that was on the founding fathers' minds, believe me, because hitherto we fought nothing but religious wars. In 1618 to 1648, we fought the 30-year war in Germany. It practically destroyed Germany, all in the name of whether to become Protestant or Catholic. We're fighting religious war still today in Gaza. And America, right from the very beginning, I have to believe this, was conscious of this, and they did not want to, get into any religious wars. And still today, you will never fight. You'll fight, to make the world safe for democracy, yes, but not a religious war. So, Washington lays down his military sword and his political sword. One of the most toxic issues at the Constitutional Convention was the idea of chattel slavery. It's oh my God, it's still today a very, very sensitive issue. Chattel slavery, it wasn't just slavery, it was chattel slavery. They were so aware, they were so conscious of this, so toxic an issue was it, that there are only 3 mentions in the Constitution about slavery, okay? And in fact, the word slavery is not even in the Constitution. The first mention of it is that Article 1, Section 2 is commonly known as the 3/5 Compromise. It stated that each enslaved individual counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of representation in Congress. It's a horrible thought when you think about it, that these African slaves are being counted as 3/5 of a person, all right? Not for themselves, but for their white, owners, and for representation, so that the South insisted on this, so that they could have greater representation in the House of Representatives. This is a compromise. The second thing, as part of this compromise, was that they did agree, and the southern states did agree with this too, that after 20 years, so in 1808, the importation of slaves would end. All right, not slavery, but the importation of slaves would end. So that's the second mention. And the third one was basically that during the Revolutionary War and afterwards, many states had ended slavery. The states could end slavery in their own states. And many in the northern states did just that. They ended slavery. But this next amendment guaranteed the southern delegates that if slaves were to, go into the north, that the northern states were bound by law to bring them back, to bring them back south. It's the whole story of Uncle Tom's Cabin, that sad story where Eliza actually, the family, they were in debt, as I recall, and in order to remedy this debt, the banker said he would set on, Uncle Tom, And, because they were property, remember, Uncle Tom was a domestic slave. And then at that point, the little Eliza was a slave woman, and her boy, 6, 7, 8, 9, I don't know how old he was, came running in, and the banker said, all right, if you get the little one, throw him in with the deal, we've got a deal, I mean, how inhumane is that? Where a child is being taken from its mother, and the mother has no say in the matter. All right, it's a very touchy issue, but I want to share some things with you here, and that is this. At the time of the writing of the Constitution, it was felt by many of the founding fathers, and I've read this, that slavery would die a natural death. That was the contention, that slavery would die a natural death. A few reasons for this. One, England, my country, had outlawed slavery in the early 1800s. Mexico had even outlawed slavery. States in the north had outlawed slavery. In fact, during the Articles of Confederation, that government, between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, they announced, put into law the Northwest Ordinance, and that meant that all those states in the Midwest, now Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, would be automatically free of slaves. They actually got that enacted, even before the Constitution. So everything was in the air. Everything was in the air, suggesting that slavery would die a natural death. It was becoming anachronistic. That's what it was. It was becoming anachronistic. In other words, it might have made sense in the 1500s and 1600s, but not now in the 1700s. And another good reason is because this is the age of enlightenment, the age of reason, the age when we're supposed to start thinking seriously about things that we had done that might not have been so good. Believe this, that many Southerners at this conference, this convention, including George Mason, they were slave owners, but they wanted to free their slaves. They were for some kind of emancipation. It wasn't just a North and South thing. They themselves want, and remember, the thing of being a gentleman, I told you that these founding fathers, many of them identified as gentlemen. And, being identified as a gentleman meant that, one, you don't discuss money. That's not what you earn, it's what you inherit. And they inherited their slaves, and they didn't know quite what to do because, as Jefferson said, it's like holding a wolf by the ears. You didn't want to be holding that wolf by the ears, but you didn't dare let it go. There were laws against manumission, meaning the freeing of slaves. And even if people like Jefferson, I say that Jefferson because people are accusing him of being a hypocrite. I didn't think he was. If he had freed his slaves, where did they go? Where did they go? And you had bounty hunters back then. Whose business it was to pick up these poor blighters. And in fact, what was sad about chattel slavery was the conspicuity of it, that they were black and easily recognizable. And when you have a bounty hunter out there, he's not going to care less whether that black person that he's apprehending is free or enslaved. He's just going to, sell them anyway, to whoever will buy him. But I believe that I believe that in my heart, whether I can defend it or not, I believe it in my heart that slavery was becoming anachronistic. But then two things happened. Oh my God. During the conference, listen to this now, during the conference, two things happened to stop it ending. And it led to the Civil War, maybe. One was that they took a break at Independence Hall and they walked down Market Street to the river. And what do you know? There was a huge, big display of something brand new. I told you earlier that in Washington's time, if anything was moving, an animal was either pulling or pushing it. But this was the very first steamship that anybody had ever seen. It was called the Perseverance. And it's the first steamship. And remember this, prior to the steamship, traffic on the Mississippi was one way. You couldn't go back, it was all one way. With the steamship, it meant that you could go back and forth with much greater ease and economy of time. And remember that many of the plantations were on rivers, and so rivers, they would come by, the boats would come by, pick up the load, whatever it was, cotton, tobacco, whatever, and move it on to market. Well, the steamship now made that even more attractive, But it was something else that was discovered just 5 or 6 years after that just destroyed this whole idea of slavery dying a natural death. And it was the invention of the cotton gin. The invention of the cotton gin, it just took everyone by surprise. Prior to the cotton gin, by the way, is an engine, right? Because I was thinking, you can make gin from cotton. Anyway, gin and tonic, please. And prior to this, the African women especially, their job was to, I don't know, has anyone ever touched cotton or I have, and you've got, it's called burrs, they're burrs. And if you look at some of the hands, I've seen pictures of some of the enslaved women's hands, just cracked to pieces, because their job was to take these burrs out by hand, and how arduous is that, and, but with the cotton gin, what it meant now is that, oh my God, you can take them out in a jiffy. So with all that land that was gained during the American Revolution, I told you, you didn't just gain your independence, but you gained all that land west of the Appalachians to the Mississippi River. Now people were moving into the Mississippi states and these other states with their cotton gins, and it spread slavery. Slavery increased in popularity. It didn't die a natural death, and I think that was the tragedy of American history. I believe that was the tragedy of American history. It did not die a natural death. In fact, if anything, the steamship and the cotton gin made it even more valuable, the industry. One of the interesting things about America and the Constitution is that, and this is especially pertinent today, I think, is that the Constitution was created. America, your nation, was created from the bottom up. Most nations are top down. In other words, God and so on. Your nation was created from the bottom up. It was created in a room, and you might ask yourself, well, now why wasn't the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, in the Constitution? It wasn't, In fact, it was the first order of business once the Constitution was ratified, and the reason is because the Anti-Federalists insisted on it. And why did they insist on it? Well, the reason it wasn't in the Constitution is because the states had their own Bill of Rights, and they felt that was good enough, But the question was, but we need to restrict the federal government, just like we're restricting the state governments as to what they can and cannot do. And so these first 10 amendments were added. There were 12 actually, but they added just 10. And basically they were designed against the federal government to tell the federal government what it could and couldn't do. So the states, and this became a theme, it was called states' rights, right up until the Civil War. And the tragedy of the Civil War, of course, it was about slavery, but the tragedy of that Civil War was that it's after the Civil War amendments, that the reverse is now true. The federal government is now telling the states what they can and cannot do. And this is in the 14th Amendment. We don't talk about it, but the 14th Amendment, if you look at the Supreme Court docket, the one amendment that they turn to more often than not these days is the 14th. It's the longest amendment of all 27. And what it does is it says here, let me read it to you. The third clause says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Expanded the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment to apply to the state as well as the federal government. So, and it was at this point that, the big contests that had been going on throughout American history between the national government and the state governments, states' rights in other words. And remember, it was states' rights that the southern states were fighting for, ostensibly. And in fact, that's how the war started, because one state decided, South Carolina decided that, it didn't like, it didn't like the idea that Lincoln was elected president without any votes from the South. So it opted out, Well, this 14th Amendment they're known as the Civil War Amendments or the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th ended slavery, and Lincoln had a part in that, by the way. The 14th gave African American citizenship. That was the big thing. And the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the vote. So they were designed really for the new African American community to blend in with American life and culture. So the 13th ended slavery. The 14th gave them citizenship, and the 15th gave them the vote. I say gave them citizenship because there was a very famous Supreme Court case just prior to the Civil War. Dred Scott, right, and where a Negro slave was suing for his freedom, and the Chief Justice at the time, Justice Taney, said, "Wait a minute, he doesn't even have any business in this court because he's not a citizen." Can you imagine that? And that was just what 3-4 years before the Civil War. I mean, it was almost like, the legislative branch had been trying to reach compromises. The White House had been trying to reach compromises, and then when it came to the Supreme Court, they make a decision like that he has no rights a white man should respect. That. It was the last thing America wanted to hear, unfortunately. One other thing about President Lincoln and the Civil War, and this is something that I don't know, you take for granted, but if you can believe this, you had an election during the Civil War. Lincoln becomes president in 1861. Inauguration back then, by the way, was in March, not January. So they had to wait a long time to actually take office. And then in 1864, President Lincoln was up for re-election. Well, in the same vein that Washington lays down his sword, his military sword, and he lays down his political sword. You're at war in any other country, there would not be, that election would be postponed, politics give way to military. You're prosecuting a war, and but yet, because of the Constitution and because President Lincoln is honoring this Constitution, you have this election. It's extraordinary. I mean, I know during World War II, we had a wartime government, where there are members from different political parties, and you don't have an election during the war. It was particularly curious because the main person he was up against was one of his former generals, McClellan, who didn't like Lincoln very much. McClellan was a Democrat, Lincoln was a Republican. Of course, Lincoln wins. We know that he won the re-election, and then sadly, just a few days after his a few months after his second inaugural, he was killed. And yet, the only thing people could talk about was, and even historians to this day, that he abandoned the writ of habeas corpus, meaning that. As president, habeas corpus simply means you have the body. What it means is that you have rights, and that if you're arrested, you have to be either charged with a crime, or released. Well, Lincoln was having people arrested without being charged with a crime, and that was a war emergency, much like what was going on in Cuba with those people there. And people talk about this to this day, but it was by dint of necessity. You can argue both ways, but that people are arguing about this during a civil war where you know the survival of your country is at stake, and he makes such a decision. I don't think it would bother me so much, but that's another noble act, I think. Finally, I want to talk about two amendments that we don't talk about so much, the 9th and 10th Amendments. I want to read the 9th Amendment, because if you're a Democrat, if you vote Democratic ticket, I think the 9th Amendment you take to heart. If you vote Republican, the 10th Amendment you would take to heart. But listen to this now. The 9th Amendment, very brief. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And what that's saying is this, is that with the Bill of Rights, for instance, they're enumerating certain rights, like your freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. But just because it's not mentioned there, right, it doesn't mean to say that you don't have that right. And if you it's retained by the people. And if you wonder where, for instance, decisions on abortion come from, there's no mention of abortion in this Constitution. It comes from an amendment like this, and also the concept of privacy. Marriage is not mentioned in the Constitution, yet nobody would deny that you have that privilege of the marriage, which is an ancient institution. You go back to ancient Egypt, we had marriage. And the 10th Amendment, and if you're a Republican with a big R, of course, we're all Republicans with a small r, the powers, it says here, not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That's the only way I can understand the Republican rebuttal of the Affordable Care Act, for instance. It's not that they don't want people to have insurance, it's that they believe it's the premise of the prerogative of the state and not of the national government. I believe that's how I understand it. I may be wrong, but I believe that's how I can understand it. So anyway, those two amendments, and what it goes to show, it's the 9th and 10th, two final amendments. It goes to show that nobody's right, nobody's wrong. This Constitution is very brief. All right. I told you already. Now I forget. How many words did it have?
49.
How many?
49.
Okay. Oh my God. I when I teach, I think the Republicans have a wonderful platform, and so do the Democrats. It's just how you see it. But my feeling is that I don't know. It would be nice to step back a little bit and appreciate the Constitution as a whole and how it came into being, and not so much quarrel. Should we quarrel about what it means? It can mean pretty much what you want it to mean. In conjunction with this, I would say that the big issue throughout your history has been concerning federalism. And it has been this question of, and it was a question at the Constitutional Convention, of whether, the national government should have power or the state governments. That was the big issue. It still is today. I know if you're Republican with a big R, you tend to feel that the national government is taking too much power. This can happen, by the way, by dint of war. Whenever you have war, remember, this has survived 2 world wars. Whenever you have a war, the national government tends to increase in strength. It's just one of those, things, it happens that way. And so ever since the Roosevelt years, perhaps we've been trying to, bring things back to how they were, maybe we can never get back to how we were. All right, Les is indicating, hold on, I just want to finish this now. Let us therefore, this is what I wrote just last night. Let us therefore continue to be Democrats or Republicans, but let us never lose track or sight of this remarkable document that has not only sustained the United States of America through 2 world wars and a very anxious Cold War, but has changed world history. It is, by all accounts, the oldest written constitution in the world. God bless the United States of America.
Very good, thank you.
Oh, yeah, okay, my pleasure. Yeah.
We can have a couple of questions before we go. Anybody want to offer a comment or a question?
Yeah.
Right here.
Oh, sorry, you're the one.
Yes,
It's my understanding that when the Constitution was written, the people who could vote were men.
Yeah.
I think they had to be over 21,
Yeah.
and landowners.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes, it's funny because you created a republic, but you had to wait some years for a democracy because blacks couldn't vote. Women had to wait till the 19th Amendment in the early 20th century. And white men without property couldn't vote. So democracy evolves. You're right, yeah.
I think your presentation was wonderful, but I would add one thing about movement of Europeans into the so-called New World. It was not an empty, unoccupied land. The removal of Native Americans, Native South and Central America was essential to what has become the United States now. And we should not forget those groups of people.
Okay, I have no answer to that. I agree. Yeah, I agree.
anyone else? Yes,
You were wondering where, was it in the consciousness, to make these changes? Dovetailing off that comment, there is a Iroquois Confederation at the same time. Did you consider that as well?
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, yeah.
Hear the question. We couldn't hear the statement.
the comment was there was an Iroquois
Confederation of.
Confederation earlier in US history than the US Constitution.
Yeah, I'm not ignoring the Native American question. This lecture is about the US Constitution. I agree with you.
It probably influenced.
Yeah, maybe you're right, yeah, yeah. I'm not ignoring this at all. All I'm trying to do is give another viewpoint on this document.
Anything else right back there? Yeah,
When I think of England, I think of the Magna Carta. Now, could you very briefly summarize what?
Well, Magna Carta, yeah, the Magna Carta, you're talking 1200, it wasn't for people, it wasn't for equality, it just gave the nobles more power over the kings, that's all. I mean, it wasn't, people often associate this with the Magna Carta, but no, that was just empowering the nobility, over the royal entourage.
okay, we'll take one last one.
2,000 years of British history, they haven't managed a constitution yet.
Well, it's curious, we don't have a written constitution.
Question.
Yeah,
Okay, let me repeat that.
2,000 years.
In 2,000 years,
No written constitution.
the British do not have a written constitution.
yeah, we don't have a written constitution, it's all based on statutes and acts of parliaments and so on. Well, I have one last question, and that is there anyone here among you that really regrets having left England? I mean, we still have Barbados and very happy people. Just kidding.
Okay, thank you very much.